I try really hard on this channel to offer unbiased reporting. That's giving you guys the facts of what's happening without resorting to partisan hackery. But here's the problem. It's getting harder and harder to have any kind of nuanced stance on this conflict. And we need to talk about the level of censorship that is kicking off. Now, when news of the attacks by Hamas on Israeli civilians first occurred, you saw in a lot of cases some really disgusting comments, some super bigoted stuff, and some really just brain dead takes justifying terror attacks on civilians and seeing those people lose their jobs and get kicked out of the public sphere. You didn't really feel bad for them. But increasingly, the stances that will get you canceled are pretty innocuous and sometimes are simply expressing some really uncontroversial ideas. So let's talk a little bit about what is going on. I'm Paul, a U.S. Army combat veteran. I served in Afghanistan, so I know a little bit about the law of war and fighting a war when the other side doesn't respect the rules. Okay, let's talk about first. I thought this was probably the most blatant example. This is a CEO of a tech conference called Web Summit, the so-called Olympics of Tech, has resigned, actually stepping down from his role as CEO of the summit following his remarks. Now, his remarks obviously must have been really bad because not only has he been forced out of his role as CEO, but the most high-profile attendees in the conference, Google's parent company Alphabet, Facebook's parent company Meta Platforms, and Amazon have all pulled out of the show. It's, of course, still going to likely take place in a scaled-down version in Lisbon. Now, Cosgrove, of course, made some statements on Twitter about Israel and Palestine, but what exactly did he say that was so controversial that the entire conference, that he had to lose his job, a conference he's been running since apparently 2009? What he said is, "We are devastated to see the terrible killings and level of innocent civilian casualties in Israel and Gaza." He said, "We condemn the attacks by Hamas and extend our sympathy to everyone who lost loved ones. We hope for reconciliation." So he said the killings of innocent people and civilians are bad. He called out Hamas specifically for doing it, and then said how sympathetic he was to everyone who's lost loved ones and his hope for peace. Guys, that's pretty innocuous. And he says to repeat, war crimes are war crimes, even when committed by allies, and should be called out for what they are. I won't relent. That's true. If you are the good guys in a conflict, you don't get to, both sides are still subject to war crimes. Now, all war crimes aren't created equal, right? Just like it's a crime to deal drugs, and it's also a crime to, be a serial killer. Obviously, one is way worse than the other. But he also on his Twitter account publicly acknowledged several other individuals who have made stances similar to his, right? Including the president of Ireland, who said that to announce in advance that you will break international law and do so on an innocent population reduces the code of protection to tatters. And of course, not everyone was a fan of Mr. Cosgrove's stance. In fact, one tech investor believed that the statement that I just read to you was supporting, I can't even say these words on YouTube, but supporting everything that Hamas did. Now, it seems weird that you think he's supporting Hamas when he says, "We condemn the attacks by Hamas." Weird. Crazy, right? Now, here's the thing, guys. Let's talk a little bit about, and then of course he was forced to resign from his role. Now I want to point out who else got canceled for making a similarly controversial stance is none other than the Pope. The Pope, who says, quote, who said in an earlier statement, quote, "I continue to follow what's happening in Israel-Palestine with great sorrow. I think of so many, in particular the children and the elderly. I renew my appeal for the liberation of the hostages and ask strongly that children, the sick, the elderly, women, and all civilians not be victims of the conflict." He added, quote, "Humanitarian law must be respected above all in Gaza, where it's urgent and necessary to guarantee humanitarian corridors and protect the entire population." He said, "Brothers and sisters, there are already so many dead. Please don't shed innocent blood, not in the Holy Land or in Ukraine or in any other place. And wars are always a defeat." Of course, this sort of stance, asking that civilians not be killed, was called unacceptable by the Israeli foreign minister, who said he, quote, expects the Vatican, which, by the way, is another sovereign nation, to come out with a clear and unequivocal condemnation of the murderous terrorist actions of Hamas terrorists who harmed women, children, and the elderly solely because they are Jewish and Israelis. Which, again, if you read his statement, he did, right? And it's unacceptable that you put out a statement expressing worry primarily for Gazan civilians while Israel is burying the 1,300 who were murdered. It's not sympathy, right? It's to say, this is, now listen, okay. This really gets in my, so, okay, there's the obvious thing. This is obviously nonsense, because saying, hey, it's bad that these people were killed, but I really hope we don't kill a bunch more people. That's like saying, how could you ask more people? How could you ask people to wear a mask when so many people have already died of COVID? You're like, well, yeah, like I don't want more to die. Like this is a very not controversial stance. Now, here's one more example we'll talk about, and then I'll explain what's actually going on here, because you guys need to know something about information operations. Semaphore, a news outlet here in the United States, has called out MSNBC, saying it's quietly taking 3 of its Muslim broadcasters out of their anchor seats since Hamas's attack on Israel. Of course, it says, amid America's wave of sympathy for Israeli terror victims, the network did not air their scheduled showing of the Mehdi Hassan show on Peacock. Also canned Aman Mohyeddin, and these are veteran journalists who spent a lot of time covering the Israel-Palestine conflict, sometimes for years at a time. These are very experienced reporters, and so the fact that they were pulled off the air simply by being Muslim, again, I don't believe they said, I couldn't find any evidence they said anything supporting the terrible things Hamas did. They seem to have just been existing while Muslim on MSNBC, which is unbelievable, because MSNBC, you guys probably know, has tried to position itself as the American left-wing version of Fox News. Very partisan content, but really has, for the better part of at least 3 years, been talking about the importance of diversity and lifting up voices and again, but when the pressure's on, you see just existing while being Muslim on MSNBC apparently is not acceptable. Now let's talk about what's really going on here. Is it really true that the entire Israeli government cannot understand the difference between that you can both express disdain and disgust at what Hamas did, and also at the same time acknowledge that war crimes are still bad? Even if someone does something bad to you, it's still a war crime. You are still capable of committing war crimes. Of course they know this, right? They are adult humans, and adult humans can understand complex ideas. This is just something that we can do. But the problem that they have is that the Israeli strategy, right, they want to destroy Hamas. This is their objective. They've said this. This isn't me speculating. Their objective is to destroy Hamas militarily and politically. The problem is Hamas is as much a government organization as it is a military wing. And so, yeah, nobody really wants to see Hamas, like, I want to see every one of those Hamas militants get smoked. I don't feel an ounce of bad when I hear one of them getting taken out. They're terrible people. They're militants. They're not soldiers. They're not fighters. They don't deserve that title, because instead of targeting the Israeli military, right, they targeted civilians. In a lot of cases, they didn't even care about that if they were Israeli at all, right? They just targeted civilians to target civilians. But the other things Hamas does within the Gaza Strip are things like social services, hospitals, functions of governance, all kinds of routine things that that are just facilitating life in that area. So if your goal is to eliminate Hamas as an entire entity, then you have no choice. You have to target you have to target all of that infrastructure. Now, there's multiple ways to do it, and this is the controversy, right? In the United States, when we wanted to dismantle the Taliban or dismantle an Iraqi insurgent network, we relied on extremely high levels of intelligence. We relied on our special operations communities. We relied on absolutely dogged pursuit of intelligence by our ground forces, right? It was resource intensive, and it took a lot more casualties than if we had pursued this strategy that the Israelis are choosing to pursue. The Israelis are simply saying, put Hamas in a box, and then you're going to just drop ordnance on that box, right? These are JDAMs they're putting on a large population. It is very efficient. It is a very efficient way to dismantle a military and political organization. The problem, in terms of casualties to your side, the problem, as we've seen, is that it's not compliant with international law or the Geneva Convention. Now, again, because you have to make the best accommodations you can to distinguish civilian from combatant. And dropping a JDAM onto an urban city block does not do that. If I had called in a JDAM strike on a population center this dense, I would be in jail. The United States would put me into jail. Okay. So in order to pursue that strategy and not, they have to silence the people that are attempting to say these things out loud, to say this is a war crime, right? And so by juxtaposing, it's a very common information operations tactic where you take an uncontroversial idea, like it's wrong to blockade food from innocent Gazans, and you intermesh it with another idea that's also uncontroversial, like Hamas terror attacks are disgusting. And so when you're able to sit there and go saying, hey, you shouldn't starve Palestinians, you go, well, is that this? You have to take this other thing, this other stance, and you have to enmesh it as fast as possible, because if you allow them to be separated, then the international community is going to apply more pressure, right? Again, this logic is very simple. It's the U.S. Look at the U.S. invading Iraq after 9/11. People were like, yeah, 9/11, it was terrible. It was a terror attack. We want to see the terrorists brought to justice. Invading Iraq, it's not clear that it does this, but the conservative media wing at the time made sure to juxtapose these things, that opposing the invasion of Iraq was the same thing as supporting the people who did 9/11. And by doing that, they were able to effectively paralyze enough people that there wasn't a meaningful political movement to try to stop that invasion. And that is the information operations strategy being pursued by Israel right now. And what irks me, of course, is that it's not being pursued within Israel. It's being pursued within the Western media and the international community. It's being pursued on you and I. And unfortunately, what we're stuck with is some guy in his office calling this out when the major media organizations, MSNBC, big tech, again, Google owns YouTube, guys. So if you don't see this video, I mean, maybe it's because the video sucks, but like it could also just be because big tech doesn't like the word war crime in Israel in their videos. If they've decided what Patty Cosgrove said was unacceptable, who knows what they're going to do to me. So anyway, guys, that's all I had. Hit like and subscribe on the video. Maybe we can trick the algorithm for a little bit. Other than that, check me out. I have a site called Combat Vet News. The link is in the description. It's premium content, but I own the site. Nobody can kick me off of it. It's mine. So anyway, I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.